review your areas of strengths. So let's get to it. In this unit, as always, it's important to review the enduring issues. For person and situation, how did measurements of intelligence and performance vary as a function of expectations and situations? If you take a smart kid, you know he's smart, and you put him or her in a class that is teaching below his or her abilities and their minimal expectations, will he or she perform at the same level? Will they still show that they're smart? If not, if they don't perform at their same levels, are they still smart? Are they still intelligent? How do measures of intelligence and performance vary as a function of expectations and situation? We also need to consider stability versus change. Can I get smarter over time? What does it mean if my intelligent test scores change over time? Is the test better? Am I getting smarter? The question is, do intelligent test scores change over time? Does that reflect that I can grow more intelligent? Or does that reflect the test, what the test is looking at in the reliability and the validity, which we'll talk about towards the end of this presentation. Also, what are the differences and similarities in the way that people process information? When you and I see the same picture or read the same question, do I process the information the same as you do? This goes to our enduring issue of diversity versus universality. We're going to talk about language. And obviously, everyone across the world does not speak the same language. Does that mean that we picture things differently? How does that impact our intelligence? What are the differences and similarities in the way people process information? Let's define cognition. We're not only talking about intelligence in this unit, we're talking about cognition as a whole. And it's all the processes whereby we acquire and use knowledge. This is how it's defined in our text, as the processes whereby we acquire and use knowledge. All of the processes. This includes perception, learning, and memory. This is why you're required to watch videos this week on sensation, perception, and memory, since we already covered learning. Obviously, cognition is a broad topic in which intelligence falls into. What are the focuses of this specific PowerPoint presentation? We are going to be looking at the three cognitive processes of thinking, problem solving, and decision making. I believe that you will find these concepts to be broader and more in depth than you realize. We will also cover the mental abilities of intelligence and creativity. We will also cover the mental abilities that psychologists are trying to measure of intelligence and creativity. What are the building blocks of thought? My child, when he was born, did not come out aware of how to do calculus. He did not know, he doesn't know currently what the color red means. So how do we get from being a small child without in-depth thinking processes to adults capable of abstract thought per Piaget's cognitive development? The three most important building blocks of thought are this, as you see on your screen: language, images, and concepts. If you think about the elements of thought, what are they? It's not simply just the words that I speak or my language, nor is it simply the mental representation of a sensory experience, the image. When I think of red, I don't just think of the word red, I don't just think of the image of the color of red, I also classify it as a color. That's a concept. It's a classification of objects, people, or experiences. Let's break down each one of these concepts. It is the flexible system of communication that uses sounds, rules, gestures, or symbols to convey information. As we learned in human development, a baby is not born with complex language. It's gained over years. Remember how we talked about at first it starts with cooing at 2 months and it progresses into babbling and starting to make sounds that mimic whatever language is spoken by the parents or caregivers. And eventually at 5 or 6 they have a vocabulary of 2,500 words. Obviously, as adults, our vocabulary is much larger, so it continues to grow. We can add to our language. It's unique to humans, the concept of language, and it's complex. Don't you hear that in the definition? A flexible system. The ability to add to it is what I hear when I hear flexible. Communication, communicating to other people, communicating to animals even. It uses sounds, rules, gestures, or symbols. So what is involved with language? Let's talk about the basic units of language. Phonemes are the unit of sound, such as if I were to say T, you may think of the unit of sound T, T. A phoneme does not play an important role in helping us think. T, what does that mean? What does that indicate to us? However, we group them together to form words. And we also group them together for prefixes and suffixes, which also give meaning. Thus, the seemingly meaningless phoneme is grouped into a meaningful unit called a morpheme, which is a word suffix or prefix. A morpheme is key in human thought. If I were to say the word hot, the morpheme of hot represents an important idea to you. From morpheme, a sentence can be formed. So I use phonemes, which is basic units of sound, to create a word, which is a morpheme. And then from morphemes, I can create sentences. And then we use grammar to influence these sentences, because it doesn't make a lot of sense if I were to say, give me 1 second, your book has a good example. If I were to say, Sally hit the car, that makes sense. Sally hit the car. Well, what did she hit the car with? If I were to say, the car hit Sally, hopefully you would be concerned. And it means something completely different than the first sentence. But if I were to say, hit Sally car, it doesn't make any sense with the way that it's structured. So I use the phoneme to create the word or the morpheme. And then I use Morpheme to create sentences, but I use grammar to structure these sentences well. Semantics is how we assign meaning to words, phrases, and sentences, which gives us the context. The syntax is the system of rules that governs our grammar. So when I take off points off your discussion board for poor sentence structure, it's because individuals need to be able to understand what's being stated to them. It's core to language that we have good grammar in order to understand what's being said. Semantics and syntax allows the speakers and the listeners to gain insight into our thoughts. You see on your screen a flowchart, and this flowchart shows that the researcher says if I'm the speaker, what I do is I start off with a thought, and then I choose words and phrases to express it, and then I produce speech sounds to communicate the words and the phrases. So I move downward. But if I'm the listener, I start by hearing the speech sounds from the speaker, and then I work my way to understanding the words that are spoken, the meanings. So you see that chart on your screen. It's also on page 219. So this is how language works. We have to have the basic sounds to form the words, to make the sentences or phrases, to communicate the meaning or the thought. However, though, thought is more than language. We also have this concept of images. If I were to say breakfast, you might understand the word breakfast, but you might also picture, as the man on your screen does, a breakfast of eggs, bacon, hotcakes, and toast. We have these images we conjure up when we consider a thought. If I say hot, you might picture a stove. Remember when we talked about Piaget's sensory motor stage of cognitive development? Children between birth and 2 years old develop an ability to form a mental representation of a sensory experience or an image per Piaget. So this image is this mental representation of a sensory experience. It can be visual, it can be sensory based, or it can be auditory based. Why are images necessary? Why not just have language? Why do I need to picture things? Why do I need to think about things in a nonverbal way? It allows us to have these concrete forms to represent complex and abstract ideas. Like when the newspaper uses a graph to illustrate how people voted in an election. Maybe you want to know, I know there's been a lot of talk lately about capturing the minority vote, which plucks my nerves in a whole nother question that we won't address in this unit, and a whole nother concept. However, the newspaper might show charts of minorities, say different minorities. It can be women, it can be ethnicity based, and they show who voted Republican and who voted Democrat based on ethnicity, let's say. So it allows us to think about that without having to read about it and without having to use language for that. Mental representations or images are not enough, though. We need to be able to classify objects, people, or experiences. That's a concept. For example, when you think about birds, do you think about a songbird or do you think about a turkey? Are they both birds? Sure, they're both birds. Concepts help us think about things and how they relate to one another. They allow us to give meaning to new experiences and organize these experiences. So concept is a mental category for classifying objects, people, or experiences. Does that mean everything's clear-cut? All concepts are clear-cut? Absolutely not. Fuzzy concepts, they are concepts that typically overlap one another and are poorly defined. So what the researcher says is there's typically a prototype or a model. This is a mental model containing the most typical features of a concept. When we encounter a new object, we compare them with the prototype to determine what they are. Thus, when I think about a bird, I see a songbird. Let's just say I see a cardinal. Obviously, there's not a cardinal pictured on your screen. I'm not sure what type of bird that is. So I picture a cardinal, and then I compare this cardinal to a turkey, and I think, what are the similarities and what are the differences? Is a turkey a bird? They both have feathers, they both have a beak, so they look similar even though they're a little different. So I guess I can classify a turkey as a bird. Human cognition goes beyond thinking about things. We use words, images, and concepts to understand our world first, but then we solve problems and make decisions. And that's the next step in the we need to transition into problem solving. Now, I just want to say that your book does review the enduring issues and questions around language if you're interested in reviewing. What are the three key aspects of problem solving? They are interpretation, strategy, and evaluation. We need to break down each one of these steps. It's not just enough to acknowledge these are the three key elements. The first step of problem solving is interpretation. Problem's representation is simply defining the problem. This is interpretation. Does this sound familiar? I would hope so. This is the first step of the scientific method as well, which you should have covered when you did your human behavior project. Why is it important to interpret the problem or to define the problem first? For you sequential learners, this appeals to you because you want to do it step by step. If you try to run ahead, hello, global learners, listen up. The impulse may lead to poor solutions. If you take the time to define the problem, you may have the ability to determine multiple possible solutions and then pick the best one. How we think about the problem determines our ability to come up with a solution. Convergent thinking is thinking directed towards one correct solution to the problem. If you rush ahead, you don't define it, you might fall into this convergent thinking. If we stay with it, it might not be a bad thing. For you accounting majors, there tends to be only one correct solution if you're trying to balance your ledger. So it's not necessarily bad for certain math problems or certain problems we encounter. However, most of the situations we face are pretty complex and they require divergent thinking. And this is a thinking that generates many possible different answers. Certain problems, they just demand this type of thinking. We need to have originality, inventiveness, and flexibility. We need to be innovative. Successful problem solving often hinges on selecting the most efficient, the most effective way to represent the problem. So if we think about it verbally, mathematically, or visually, since the representation of the problem influences the type of strategies that we use to pursue the problem. If I'm presented with a word problem on a test, actually there's a word problem on page 235 that I got wrong because I pictured it verbally. Well, actually, I should have pictured it visually, and I would have gotten the right answer. But I engaged in some global thinking and possibly just rushing ahead, and I didn't define the problem before I tried to come up with a solution, which ended up with the wrong answer. Your text discussed how Albert Einstein visually represented problems, leading to his determination of solutions. He was a genius, and he chalked it up to visually seeing the problem. So the way we picture it, the way we define it, the way we represent the problem determines the solution that we're going to achieve. Problem representation also influences problem categorization, which helps problem solvers make connections between the current problems we face and the similar problems that we face in the past. If I picture, say I have an issue with a client and I consider it verbally, if I consider it based on the words that are being said, maybe the word that this client used is similar to the wording that a previous client used, I may then think about how I handled the problem with the previous client and pull from that solution. Your text gives the example of a chess player. The ones that are seasoned tend to pull their solutions when they're facing a move from previous games that they played. So my long-term memory, I remember that I made this move or my opponent made this move and it resulted in winning the game. This is problem categorization. I've faced this before. Let me face this again. Let's look at the strategies though for dealing with problems, because we need to interpret the problem, determine a strategy, and then evaluate how the solution went. The first problem-solving strategy is trial and error. This works best when choices are limited. It's simply, let me try this. If it works, then I'll do it again. If it doesn't work, I won't do it again. It wastes time when there's a lot of options to test. If I were given a key ring with 4 keys, and I was to say, let's go ahead and see which one works, I might try all 4 keys. If I was given a key ring with 100 keys, that would waste a lot of time. And it would be my luck that it would be the very last key that would work in the door. So, what's another option for a strategy? Trial and error may work, but it's very limited. You have information retrieval, and this is retrieval of information from your long-term memory about how the problem was solved in the past. If I faced a similar problem in the past, or I learned a solution, it may be very effective and efficient to do this way. How would this play out in your major? For medical assisting students, you may have previously assisted patients who weren't ambulatory into the exam room. And so when you face another patient who's not ambulatory, you're like, well, this is what I did in order to fix this problem. Retrieving that information helps you solve the problem at hand, and it may be very, very quick. An algorithm is a step-by-step method of problem solving that guarantees a correct solution. For those of you that are accounting majors or IT majors, this term should be very familiar because there's certain computer algorithms I understand in programming. There's also algorithms within math. How does it play out for us though day to day? Sometimes we're able to follow step-by-step instructions to successfully solve a problem. Any examples that you can think of? Let's think offhand. What's a day-to-day algorithm? If you buy furniture from Target, I see the instructions as an algorithm. It's been proven that if you follow the instructions, if you're able to understand them, that you're going to be able to put part A with part B using C, and you're going to end up with a bookcase at the end. It's a step-by-step method of problem solving that you're going to get the correct solution or the product at the end. They're not always algorithms though. We need to have these rules of thumb. They help us simplify and solve problems, but they don't guarantee a correct solution like an algorithm does. What are some rules of thumb? We have hill climbing, and this is a problem-solving strategy in which each step moves a person progressively towards the final goal. After each step, we determine how much closer we are, how much further we need to go, and the next step. Your book is the example of eliminating in multiple choice the obviously wrong answer. I told my on-ground class last week that there are distractors. Normally in multiple choice, you have 4 possible answers. There's normally 2 distractors, the right answer and one that's close to the right answer. In hill climbing, you would eliminate the 2 wrong answers that are obviously wrong. Sub-goals is another rule of thumb problem-solving strategy where it's an intermediate, more manageable goals used in problem-solving to make it easier to reach the final goal. Sometimes we need to break things down. Maybe you have a goal for this class of receiving a B. If I receive a B, I'll be happy. Well, you have to have sub-goals along the way. You need to do well on this week's quiz if you want to get a B. You may set a goal for yourself for this week's quiz of a 35 out of 40. Once that's completed, you set another sub-goal of completion of the classroom activity well and turning it in on time to get that distinguished marks. Those are sub-goals. Pretty cut and dry. It's a rule of thumb. Let me set sub-goals along the way so I can achieve my long-term goal. This shouldn't be foreign to you guys at this age. A means ends analysis is a strategy that aims to reduce discrepancy between the current situation and the desired goal with a number of intermediate points. So it's kind of hill climbing and kind of sub goals if you listen to that definition. We want to assess where we're at, which is hill climbing, and we want to set goals along the way. What's different about it is that you might take a step backwards in order to reach an end goal. It's more effective because it demands flexible thinking. It allows you to see the big picture, and global learners is going to appeal to you because it allows you to adjust your direction to reach the desired solution. I love the example your book gives of a pitcher in a baseball game intentionally walking the best hitter of the other team in order to avoid a hit. You would walk the best hitter. If you have somebody that comes up to the plate that normally has home runs, they've got a great batting average, you may walk them so that they don't hit in, the two people on base. So you're taking a step backwards because ultimately a walk is not a good statistic for a baseball game, but it's successful because it's pursuing your ultimate goal. The other rule of thumb that we're going to cover for problem-solving strategy is this working backwards. You work backwards from the desired goal to your given conditions. And this may seem really confusing, but let's give this example of working within a budget. You know you're only allowed to spend $100 on eating out this month. That's what you and your family decided, you and your wife, or you decided personally. Instead of adding together your receipts at the end of the month, because you may or may not hit your goal. If you're like me, that's the way I tend to want to budget. Okay, I'm going to have an arbitrary number. I'm going to try to reach that, and at the end of the month, I'm going to see if I reached it. The better solution, the working backwards solution, is I take $100. I put it in the envelope. Every time I go out to eat, I pull that money from that envelope. You're working backwards. At the end of the month, unless you added more money to your envelope, you didn't spend over that $100. I do have to say thank you to the discussion board when we talked about a behavior that you would like to modify, and Dave Ramsey for this concept of wise financial planning through the envelope system. If you have any questions on that system, please send me an email. So here's a problem for you. Using only the items on top of the desk, how could you attach the candle to the wall above the desk so that when the candle burns, it does not drip wax onto the desk? Can you solve this problem? The answer is in the video in week 6 content folder. Try the problem first before you check out the solution, and don't tell other people until they have a chance to do it themselves. Let's look at some obstacles that may make this problem a little difficult for you. The first obstacle is your level of motivation or emotional arousal. Perhaps you're watching this video or listening to this video at the middle of the night. You don't feel like, you know you have to get it done, but you don't feel like the challenge of that problem. So your emotional arousal may be low and your motivation may be low. This concept should ring true of what we studied last week. It is believed that we need a surge of excitement to motivate ourselves to solve a problem. But as we talked about last week, you can't have too much energy. This is the arousal theory. What else affects our ability to solve problems well? There's this concept of a mental set. It's a tendency to perceive and to approach problems in certain ways. These can be helpful if we've learned approaches and strategies that we can apply to the problem we're facing. Kind of like the chess player. Well, I did this previously, let me approach this in the same way. But it can also be a hindrance because the problem we're facing might require flexibility. It might require a new approach, a novel approach to solve it. Have you ever worked with someone who's unwilling to try new things? This is the way it's always worked. This is the way it must stay. They're operating within a mental set, and they're using that convergent thinking more than likely that there's only one right possible solution. The best problem solvers use their mental sets to choose several possible solutions and to judge when to change sets or to abandon them. This is divergent thinking. Functional fixedness is when it's a mental set where we perceive only a limited number of uses for an object. I wonder how many of you are engaged in that with the problem that you just saw. The video on Blackboard, which gives the solution, talks about functional fixedness. I see Pinterest changing people's functional fixedness as it depicts many uses for things that are different than the original use. The concept of upcycling is the same. Your book does talk about within the same section about obstacles to solving problems, about insight and intuition. Occasionally the solution presents itself out of the blue. This is a mental breakthrough that occurs after we widen our scope of attention to consider alternatives, or a more diverse set of solutions, besides the obvious or incorrect solutions. Remember when we talked about this when we talked about learning? Your textbook on page 230 discussed some recent breakthroughs, that's my pun for you guys, about insight and intuition through neuroimaging and what they notice in the brain when this insight happens. Brainstorming helps to minimize mental sets because it allows an individual or a group to produce numerous ideas and evaluate them only after all the ideas have been collected. If you choose to watch Dan Pink when he talks throughout the whole TED Talk, he talks about how some companies have given time to individuals to think of these creative ideas and to break through, to brainstorm and break through this mental set. And a lot of times that's how stuff like Gmail, they said, I think Gmail was an example he gave, was discovered, was made because of this. A more skillful problem solver. We need to eliminate poor choices. We need to visualize a solution. We need to develop expertise, and we need to think flexibly. Your book on page 229 details this more thoroughly. So let's talk about decision making. How is that different than problem solving? I mean, it is problem solving, but how is it? Decision making is a type of problem solving in which we already know all of the possible solutions or choices. In effect, the task involves making a choice from among a set of options that present the greatest benefit or possible solutions. The process of decision making involves identifying the best solution. Sometimes this can be very, very difficult. This model is a rational decision-making model in which choices are systematically evaluated on various criteria. So for each choice, the attractive features can be compensated for the unattractive feature. The option that best meets the most important criteria should be the option that is selected. This approach to decision-making works well when it's easy to identify and evaluate various features of each of the available options from which one is choosing. How to apply this? Determine what's most important to you. You can determine which degree is most lucrative based off this model. But what if you found out a friend with the degree you're pursuing, after applying this decision making, has not been able to get a job? Would you still pursue the degree? Let's look at the rules of thumb for decision making. Representativeness is where a new situation is judged based off of its resemblance to a stereotypical model. We make a decision based upon how an option matches our model of a typical member of a category. For example, when choosing a new cell phone, we compare our options to the model cell phone in order to determine if the potential cell phone exceeds or falls short of our model phone. Availability is making a decision based on information that is most easily retrieved from memory. Of course, just because the information is readily available to us from our own experiences does not mean that it's accurate. The subway effect is described on page 232. Then there's this whole confirmation bias. This is a tendency to notice and remember evidence that supports our beliefs, but to ignore or overlook evidence that contradicts them. This bias is related to the availability rule of thumb, and that it skews information that's readily available to us in memory. The confirmation bias tends to reinforce our tendencies to see patterns of cause and effect where none exist. In effect, we believe that two correlated events have a cause and effect relationship, despite evidence to the contrary. It is the belief that sugar causes hyperactivity. Why do we believe this when evidence says it's not true? We need to watch these rules of thumb when we are making decisions as employers, managers, and parents. Sometimes we have to fall back on availability. If I need to make a split-second decision, I need to think about what worked in the past and go with it. But in the best decision making, I think it's best to consider the bias. Remember when we talked about how to think like a scientist? You probably don't want to think about that given your human behavior project completion. However, it's important to analyze our assumptions, to not oversimplify. It's important to consider alternative interpretations. And there are other reasons than just these 3 rules of thumb listed on your screen. There's also the concept of framing. Have you ever been able to sweet talk your way into something? Why is the cliche true that you attract more flies with honey than with oil? It's based off this concept of framing. It's the perspective from which we interpret information before making a decision. The information, the way it's presented, highly influences your final decision. Your book gives the example of individuals making medical decisions in the way that it was presented. It influences the final decision. If I want to get my way, I know how to frame it for someone that they may consider what I want done. And people tend to frame situations, and it tends to cause a bias. When I do cognitive behavioral therapy, we talk about framing and to reframe the solution and the decision at hand. Then there's this concept of hindsight. They say hindsight's 20/20. What is this hindsight bias? We think afterwards. We have this tendency to see outcomes as inevitable and predictable after we know the outcome. So why didn't I do that? Obviously that was going to work out that way. Well, this is a cognitive flaw because we didn't know the outcome. I mean, sometimes we do stupid stuff. I mean, that's just true of humans. And for whatever reason, we do things that we shouldn't, even if we knew better. Sometimes it's rushing ahead. Sometimes it's impulse. Sometimes there's a lot of different factors within that. But to look back and say, I should have done it this way, it explains away our bad decisions. Now, it can help us replace misinformation about faulty assumptions so we make better decisions in the future. It just depends on how much emphasis we put on this hindsight. Counterfactual thinking is this. It's thinking about alternative realities and things that never happened. This thinking often takes the form of, if I had only done blank differently, then this would or would not have happened. We may use this kind of thinking to mentally revise the events or actions that led to the actual outcome we experience, or to improve future decision making. But I believe, especially counterfactual thinking, that what if thinking can lead to undue anxiety and depression. It is wise for us to consider how we could have done something differently. However, to over-focus on it can lead us to second-guessing ourselves, putting ourselves down. So we need to use these for what they bring to the table to explain our decisions, to consider how to do them better, but we need to have to overfocus or overthink about it. It's kind of interesting that it's in the section of your book that they talk about multitasking. It really has just become a way of life in our digital age. It's because it's so commonplace, I believe that there's some commonly held assumptions about it. We believe that it makes us more efficient. That doesn't stand up as far as research goes. It can result in limited, enhanced productivity when the multitasker is engaged in tasks that are dissimilar. The multitasker is an experienced multitasker, and the multitasker is intelligent, whatever intelligent may be. But if you're not intelligent, not experienced, or not engaging in tasks that are dissimilar, the research on multitasking indicates that multitasking slows down thinking, decreases accuracy, and can increase stress. It's believed one of the assumptions is that young people are better at multitasking than older adults. The research compared 18 to 21-year-olds against 35 to 39-year-olds found that the negative effects of multitasking were more pronounced in the younger group. There's also the assumption that I can talk on the phone while driving and I will be okay. And your book does talk about and has some good research, if you took the time to find it, for your human behavior project about texting while driving. And the research in your book says that braking response slows down by 35%, steering control is reduced by 91%. So these are far greater impairments than would be caused by driving while under the influence of a substance like marijuana or alcohol. And we know that that's bad to do those things. Just talking on the phone while driving results in impaired braking time and reduced attention to events in your peripheral vision field. And these results were observed even if somebody was a good multitasker or if they are instructed to give more attention to the task of driving than talking on the phone. Professor David Meyer, who's an expert on multitasking, concluded that if you're driving while cell phoning, then your performance is going to be as poor as if you are legally drunk. And I'm not sure if this matches the results of your human behavior project if you chose to study it, but it would be interesting to look at that and to compare your argument with the one in our book. Let's segue into the concept of intelligence. Intelligence is the general term referring to the ability or abilities involved in learning and adaptive behavior. We have a definition, as you see on your screen, but it's still a complex question. You have to take an intelligence test for your classroom activity this week. Are you nervous? Do you anticipate what it's going to say? You also need to detail on the discussion board what types of questions you believe belong on an intelligence test. Our book defines intelligence as a general term referring to the ability or abilities involved in learning and adaptive behavior. Let's look at the theories that you're going to on. Charles Spearman said that intelligence is a singular general quality about a person, that if someone is bright in one area, they tend to be bright in other areas. He almost coined it, or the way that he approached it makes it seem like a character trait. Like I might be hot-tempered, I might be intelligent. It was general and it was broad. L.L. Thorstone, hopefully I'm saying that right, believed that intelligence is comprised of 7 distinct and independent mental abilities. Think for a minute, what would you think that those mental abilities would be? What did you come up with? Perhaps that's going to educate you when you write your discussion board. He believed that those mental abilities were spatial ability, memory, perceptual speed, word fluency, numerical ability, reasoning, and verbal meaning. He believed that you might be highly intelligent in the ability to perceive distance, which is spatial, but struggle with word fluency. So Charles Spearman believed that intelligence is singular, general quality about a person. L.L. Thorstone believes 7 distinct, independent mental abilities. You might excel in one area but not in the other. Do not confuse Thorstone with Howard Gardner, who we're going to talk about. We do have Sternberg's theory, and he believed there was 3 types of intelligence in his theory of intelligence, and he put this out in 2009. First of all, you have the analytical, and this is more of your book smart. That's the way I like to coin it. It involves mental processes emphasized by most theories of intelligence. When you take a IQ test, it's testing that analytical side. Creativity involves in adapting to new tasks and situations to gain insight. And your book does a really good job going through that more. But no, for Sternberg, he believed in the analytical, the creative, which is adapting to new tasks and situations, and the practical, which is finding solutions to practical and personal problems. So that's what I consider your street smarts, is the practical side. He believed that current intelligence tests do not capture this broad array of abilities. What do you think? Would your intelligence test include analytical aspects? Would there be creative aspects? Would there be practical aspects? How would you do that? Howard Gardner had a theory of multiple intelligences, and he works, I believe he is part of Harvard's University. And you can actually go onto his website. He has a website with several papers in PDF form that you can read. And I was reading them to prepare for this lecture and to prepare for your classroom activity. Obviously not all of them, but I did read a couple. And it's interesting to gain some insight into the theorist. So if you're interested, I can post some of those resources. He believed in 8. Hear me, 8. Unlike L.L. Thorstone, who believed in 7, he believed in 8 multiple intelligences. They're different and they're independent of each other. Verbal, linguistic, musical, logical, mathematical, spatial, bodily, kinesthetic, interpersonal, intrapersonal, and naturalistic. The intelligence test you have to take determines which of these areas are your strongest and weakest. After taking it, you will complete the worksheet and consider whether the results were accurate. Use the thinking critically about questions on page 236 to aid in your consideration of the question of what to include in your intelligence tests. We also have emotional intelligence that was a construct proposed by Daniel Goleman. And he said that this is how effectively people perceive and understand your own emotions and the emotions of others, and how they regulate and manage their own emotional behavior. Now, Howard Gardner did include that in his intrapersonal and interpersonal areas of intelligence for his 8. This is what Daniel Goleman said. There's 5 traits that contribute to emotional intelligence. Knowing your own emotions, managing those emotions, using your emotions to motivate yourself, recognizing the emotions of others, and managing those relationships. Let's talk about IQ tests, because that's typically what people think of when they think of intelligence. The Stanford-Binet intelligence scale was originally developed to consider placement for school-age children. It measures verbal reasoning, abstract and visual reasoning, quantitative reasoning, and short-term memory. It yields intelligence. It yields an IQ, which is a numerical value that is determined from performance on the test, and it's normed around a score of 100. So 100 is a person of normal average intelligence. If you want a sample, some of the questions asked on the Stanford-Binet test, you can look in your book on page 235. On your screen, you see a bell curve, that's what it's called in statistics, of where people normally fall. Now, there are people in the high 160s, which are incredibly smart. I believe 130 is the point where you're considered genius. And there's also people that are lower than 80, and we're going to talk about that. There's another IQ test, which is the Wechsler intelligence scale. There's one for children and there's one for adults. It differs from the Stanford-Binet because Wechsler believes that intelligence consists more of the ability to handle life situations than to solve verbal and abstract problems. It yields a verbal and a performance score as well as an overall score of intelligence. It considers verbal comprehension, perceptual reasoning, working memory, and processing speed. When I ask for a child to receive a neuropsychological evaluation, we call neuropsychs for short, a lot of times they will measure for intelligence. That's part of the core. It's one of the core tests that they do. They don't use the Stanford-Binet. They do use the Wechsler, and they use the one for children. And a lot of times I see in the scores for the one with children, there's often a score for working memory. In children that have attention hyperactivity disorder. I said that wrong, ADHD. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD tend to score low when it comes to working memory. But you often wonder, I wonder, when my kiddos go for that test, is it truly capturing their intelligence? And that's what you need to consider in your discussion board. Is it culturally fair? Intelligence tests are designed to eliminate cultural bias by minimizing the use of language, as well as the use of skills and values that vary from culture to culture. They have culturally fair tests. They're not, I wouldn't say that the Stanford-Binet, even though they've made efforts, nor the Wechsler, even though they've made efforts, are truly what's considered a culturally fair. They do have performance tests which try to eliminate the need to have that language, because most IQ tests are written. You have to read them. So if you're illiterate or you don't understand the language, it can be translated, but that doesn't, if you speak another language, you know that the connotations and the sarcasm and the idioms are different. So we need intelligence tests, especially when services are based off of that, accommodations are based off of that, school placements are based off of that, that aren't based on prejudice, bias, or preconceived notions. The performance test uses problems that minimize or eliminate the use of words, like completing a map, completing a maze. The culturally fair try to minimize the use of language, and they also, again, try to minimize the value set that certain cultures emphasize. So as you design in your discussion board post your IQ test, consider how can we seek to minimize this bias, preconceived ideas, prejudice, because tests are often written by people of the majority, and make sure that people that aren't the majority have a chance to show their true intelligence. Is there a biological measurement for intelligence? There has been attempts by researchers for decades to assess intelligence using biological markers, and we'll discuss why. However, to date, there's nothing that approaches the accuracy of psychological tests. Let's talk about the accuracy. Intelligence tests should be both valid and reliable. Reliable implies dependability and consistent scores yielded. When I give you a test, I should be able to give you the same test a week later with similar results. If I give you an IQ test this year, your results from next year should be similar. Validity implies ability of a test to measure what it's supposed to measure. If I give you the Stanford Binet and I give you the Wechsler, you should score similarly if they're both truly measuring intelligence. What are the criticisms of IQ tests? They're controversial because we don't agree on what intelligence is. You're being quizzed over the different theories of intelligence, and I'm sure there's several more. Critics argue that tests assess a very limited set of mental skills, and that some tests, like I'm saying, they're unfairly biased against minority groups. Poor performance in school may be the result of, rather than caused by, low test scores. And psychologists tend to agree on the validity of IQ tests to predict academic grades and obtaining high-status occupations such as MDs and lawyers, and doctors and lawyers. It's kind of interesting because a lot of the super smart people I know tend to be more analytical. If you think about Sternberg's 3 areas of intelligence, the street smarts, book smarts, and the creative side. And they may not be, some of them have incredible amount of common sense too. But I wonder if IQ tests are really geared towards that type of learner and that type of intelligence. Because I'm pretty smart when it comes to certain things, and I know that about myself. But I really struggle to do what I'm doing right now, which is present to you with my verbal command. I'm I believe I'm well written. I believe I communicate much better on paper than I do in person. It's something that I continue to work on. But I score extremely well on written tests. But what if you're the opposite? What if you're really well spoken and you think a lot better using verbalization out loud as opposed to written communication? You may not score as high. I think there's also the consideration of person and situation as detailed in your book. Does it benefit a child to score low on IQ tests? You better believe it. If that means that it's extra adult attention, we need to make sure that we're truly capturing a child or a person's ability and not inadvertently reinforcing poor performance. Check out pages 240 and 241 for your discussion board. How are you going to compensate for these criticisms? So, nature versus nurture, right? Is intelligence from my mom? Is it from my teachers? Was I born that way, or did I learn? Is it inherited, or is it a product of the environment? Approximately 50% of the differences in intelligence are due to genetics, and 50% are due to differences in environments. They've done twin studies to help them understand the influence of heredity. The IQ scores of identical twins raised together is remarkably high. They share a common genotype and a common environment. The IQ scores of identical twins raised separately is very high as well, indicating that there's a strong genetic component to intelligence. So my brothers are twins. Let's pretend for a minute that they're identical. Raised together, the likelihood of them being of similar scores intelligence-wise is very high. Had they been raised separate, it's also very high. So thus, it doesn't really answer the question. We don't really know. With that being said, that does not mean that there's not influences on intelligence. To begin with, genetic influence on IQ varies with economic status. In impoverished families, heredity has little influence on IQ, whereas in affluent families, its influence is stronger. We know that prenatal nutrition influences IQ scores, as does nutrition during infancy. Malnutrition tends to lower IQ scores by 20 points on average. And they also believe that the use of vitamin supplements during childhood affects intelligence. There's been research on orphanages in the 1930s that revealed that children raised in stimulating environments exhibit significant increases in IQ scores compared to children raised in environments that offer little stimulation or support. And that's why we discussed in development how it's essential for children when they're wee little to receive that stimulation because their brain's still growing. And remember, we're born with all these neurons, but it's during the first 2 years and throughout childhood, but especially during the first 2 years, that those neurons start to connect and the synapses are present, and all of a sudden, all of that stuff becomes interwoven. Intervention, there was a Milwaukee project done in the 60s, and then there was a Head Start program done that's been throughout that provides this early enrichment and nutrition to children and their families. Research on these intervention programs has revealed dramatic benefits for the participants: increased IQ scores, enhanced cognitive and language development, higher academic achievement, and lower delinquency rates. So interestingly enough, having children in a daycare setting, in a Head Start setting, helped with IQ scores, cognitive and language development, higher academic achievement later, and lower delinquency rates. So for those of you that argued about it's better for a child to stay home, how would this impact your consideration of that question? Now, typically Head Start, not typically, but at times Head Start provides for a child what a family cannot provide at home as far as nutrition and education. So if that is provided, I don't want you to worry and all of a sudden place your child in daycare and think that the mama at home or the daddy at home can't do the same or similar to what's being done at daycare. It's just another piece of that puzzle to consider. There's what's called the Flynn Effect. I think I'm saying that name right. Please forgive me. IQs have increased in the population as a whole, and it's kind of interesting because from the 1930s to the 1970s, because IQ tests, the original Stanford-Binet, did not come out until the early 1900s. James Flynn, I'm thinking I'm saying his name right, from New Zealand, noticed that IQs have increased in the population as a whole, so much that it's increased like 3 to 6 points per decade. And that's quite a bit when you add those years up. There's been a lot of explanations for this phenomenon offered. People are better at taking tests, improved nutrition and healthcare, increasingly complex world, but none account entirely for the magnitude of the change over time in the mean IQ of the population. There's more information in your text if you're interested. I think it's kind of an interesting consideration. Like, are we measuring what we are supposed to be measuring? What about gender? Who's smarter? Recent research suggests that while gender differences are observed, they're relatively small and they're concentrated in very specific skills. Males and females don't differ significantly in most cognitive abilities. What are those specific skills? Long established advantage that girls have over boys in verbal abilities applies only to written verbal skills. Boys tend to outperform girls on tests of visual spatial skills, which accounts for most of the gender-related differences on standardized math tests. Men are much more likely, this is so interesting to me, than women to fall at the extremes of the intelligence range. 7 out of 8 people with extremely high IQ scores were men, while approximately the same ratio is observed among those with mental retardation. There are no gender differences on measurements of general intelligence. So girls tend to outperform boys when it comes to written verbal skills, and boys tend to outperform girls when it comes to math. Again, how much of it is environment versus nurture versus nature. That's why they say that boys tend to struggle more with English classes and writing classes, and girls struggle more with science and math. There's been a lot of push to get girls into that science and math area. What about culture? For decades, American children have lagged behind children in China and Japan with respect to reading and math abilities, and recent evidence says that this gap is widening. When first and fifth grade children in America perform more poorly than their counterparts in China and Japan, their poor standing continues through the 11th grade. Cultural attitudes towards ability and effort account for much of the differences between cultures. Most American students attribute success in the classroom to innate ability, where and also it's kind of interesting, most American teachers think that you're either good at math or you're not. Where Asian students and their parents and their teacher believe that effort and studying hard determine success. This has significant consequences for the way children, parents, and their teachers approach the task of learning. It appears that it's the cultural differences in math and reading abilities reflect the differences in effort to learn rather than intelligence across cultures. That's a really important statement. It reflects the differences in the effort to learn rather than the differences in intelligence across cultures. If we're going to talk about intelligence, we need to talk about mental retardation, and a lot of times the appropriate term now is intellectual disability. They call it ID now, intellectual disability. To be diagnosed with this, you must have low IQ and the inability to function independently. Both of those must be present. And you see on there the levels of mental retardation. If you have mild, you're able to adequately function in society and learn skills comparable to a sixth grader, but sometimes you need help during that unusual times of stress. Then there's moderate, and this is mid-30s to low 50s. You might be able to do vocational training, hold a job, travel alone, second grade level, and they can do skilled work under supervision. If you have severe, you don't typically learn to talk or practice hygiene until after age 6. They can't do vocational skills, but you can do simple tasks. Profound it's so sad. It's typically with a neurological disorder, and you pretty much can't do anything for yourself. It's a spectrum. There is a concept of a savant, and that's someone that may not be able to care for themselves but has remarkable ability in a certain area, such as numerical computation, art, or music. The causes of mental retardation aren't known, although about 25% can be traced to biological causes, such as having Down syndromes, PKU, if you know what that is, or environmental, like lead poisoning, societal neglect, nutrition, having malnutrition. There's a lot of risk factors. There are some biological causes, like I said, but a lot of times it could be any of that. It could be biological, it could be genetic, it could be social, environmental, nutritional. There are intervention programs that alleviate the it's in order to help that person gain skills and gain ability, because I would want to if I had that, I would want to do the best that I could with my life. Um, I wouldn't I don't think that I would want to just have someone care for me. I think that would lead to a lot of frustration. I've actually seen that where it's a lot of frustration because they want to do for themselves, and not teaching them is such a disservice. So they have what's called inclusion. They used to call it mainstreaming, where in K through 12th grade educational settings, centers for adults, that you choose to put the child or the adult with members of society as they're members of society. You treat them with dignity and you don't separate them. For a long time, there was this idea that of institutionalization, whether you had a mental illness or a mental retardation, that you didn't live amongst the general community. You were separated, and they found that having this mainstreaming actually is beneficial in the long run. We're going to talk about one extreme of intelligence. We have to talk about the other, and that's giftedness. Its special abilities usually exhibited only in a few areas, and superior IQ combined with demonstrated or potential ability in such areas like academic aptitude, creativity, leadership. Pretty sure it's 130 to be classified as gifted, so you can receive special services within the school setting. School systems typically identify gifted children with the use of testing, of interviews, and evaluation of academic and creative work. They're normally recommended for evaluation by teacher or by parent. There's this misconception that if you're gifted, you must be socially inept, and that's not true. Moderate levels of giftedness brings about social advantages to gifted children. There might be children that struggle socially who were gifted, just as there might be individuals of normal intelligence who struggle socially. They might face challenges when going through that. Like if I have to skip a grade and I may not be socially advanced, but I may be academically advanced, what does that look like? Causes of giftedness aren't known. Again, intelligence may be heredity based, it may be environmentally based. They have enrichment programs, and there are some pros to them. It's intellectually fulfilling. A lot of times my students that are gifted, maybe they don't get classified as gifted, but they've got extreme intelligence. That boredom leads to wanting to do something, which may lead to disrupting the class or being smarter than the teacher. I had one kiddo who was way smarter than me, and he was in second grade reading about 14th century France, in a library in that dusty corner, those thick books on the history of whatever country. He loved to read those in second grade, but yet he was being taught fractions for the first time. And he was in a mainstream classroom. It can be difficult to meet their intellectual need and their social need. And if you're really smart, you might become socially isolated. You might not get invited to things, and being part of an enrichment program separate from your peers or being in higher grades may make that more difficult. It's something for the parent to consider. I promised we would talk about creativity, and this is where we're going to. Creativity is the ability to produce novel, which means new, and socially valued ideas or objects. Creativity is the ability to produce novel and socially valued ideas or objects. Early research found no correlation between creativity and intelligence, but those early studies focused on bright individuals. Some evidence has been found for the threshold theory that creativity and intelligence are linked, but only to a certain level of IQ. Then the relationship disappears. There's more information in your book if you want to read about it, but overall the support has been mixed. Here's what we do know. Creative people tend to be perceived as more intelligent than less creative people with equal IQ scores. So you meet two people, they're of equal IQ, they score the same on the IQ test, all of them. But you can tell that they're more creative, they're believed to be more intelligent, and that's definitely a social construct. Creative people also tend to be more extroverted, and we're going to talk about personality next week, but that tends to be the truth. And they tend to be problem finders as well as problem solvers. They will work on problems they identify, often with extraordinary dedication, ambition, and uh, persisting as they pursue the solutions to the problems they are addressing. So they want to find the answer, and they will persist till they do. There are tests, and I'm not going to go through each one for creativity. You see them there on your screen. The reason I'm not going to go through each one is because there's not high degrees of validity, and a lot of it's because it's so subjective. Um, so we can't always say, like, let's sit Johnny down and see if he's creative. It really, it's hard to measure, probably even harder to measure than intelligence. It requires original responses to situation. You can't give a multiple choice. And then if you give open-ended questions, it's subject to my interpretation. Who's grading that? So they are detailed in your text if you're interested. All right, now that you're done, go watch the video to see if you got the answer right as far as the candle and the box of matches or the box of text. See if you got the answer right, and then watch the videos on sensation, perception, and on memory. Thank you.